Do I find it hard to part with swords? Hey folks, Matt Easton here. So this is a somewhat personal question, but someone recently asked me, I think under the comments under one of my videos, whether I find it difficult to part with swords. And it's funny because no one's asked me this for a long time, so it's fairly widely known that I buy and sell swords. I regularly liberate swords from my collection in order to fund the purchase of other swords. So like anyone who has a kind of rabid collecting habit, like I honestly do, I mean, it's fairly obvious I have got a lot of swords and other antique weapons. And frankly, unless you're an extremely wealthy person, which I'm not, unfortunately, if you want to buy more stuff, you often have to sell stuff. And as inevitably, as you start to get more knowledgeable about what you're buying, you can make a little bit of profit here and there, and that enables you to buy things that are potentially more expensive than you could have afforded otherwise. If you're only buying, then clearly you can only use your expendable income. But if you're buying and selling, then sometimes you can scale up your collection. So another person recently, and these two things are connected, another person asked me recently how I got into collecting antique swords. Well, it's actually quite simple. I was obsessed with swords and ancient warfare and medieval warfare and history growing up, and I, in my teenage years, realised that it was possible to buy antique objects, as well as obviously getting replica objects, but I very quickly decided that I wanted to start building up a collection. And so when I was probably about 14, I started collecting bayonets. And the reason I started collecting bayonets is not because I was especially interested in bayonets, but because they were affordable. If I went to an antique fair, I mean, I was lucky I grew up with parents who were quite interested in antiques, and my dad, in fact, before I was born, I believe, used to buy and sell antiques a little bit. So he had an interest in antiques, and I inevitably inherited that partially. And so my parents used to go to antique sales and things like this, and I occasionally used to see antique knives and antique swords and antique bayonets, and I was like, wow, I want these. But I wasn't I wasn't wealthy. Clearly I didn't have money as a child to go and buy these things I wanted. And so when I did save together some of my pocket money, the things that I could most immediately afford were bayonets. So I started collecting bayonets, but really it was because I wanted to collect swords, but I couldn't afford swords at that point. Anyway, to shorten the story, essentially I collected bayonets until I got to a point where I was starting to have, Saturday jobs and stuff like this when I was about 16, 17 years old. And so I started to have a bit more money for myself, and I did start collecting swords at that point. And Victorian swords, it's funny because I was pretty much obsessed with the medieval period at that point, but Victorian swords were the most affordable at that point. Since that point, so I'm now 40 years old, sadly. God, how did I get that old? But I probably bought my first antique sword, I think, when I was either 16 or 17. I can't actually remember now. I think possibly 16. And I saved up money for a while, and it cost me, I believe it cost me about £90 or maybe £100, and it's a good sword, and it's still in my collection. It's actually, as coincidence should have it, a relatively rare sword, so it's an 1861 pattern. I'll pull it out and show it to you at some point. Anyway, I'll talk about that sword in a different video because it's worth talking about by itself. But I have kept that sword for two reasons. One, it's reasonably rare and it's a nice sword, but most importantly because it's the first antique sword I bought. So I've kept it for sentimental reasons, really. It doesn't really fit in my collection otherwise. But so I bought that, and Victorian swords at that point were much more affordable than other periods of swords. But when I was 16, 17, I was pretty much obsessed with the medieval period. And I studied medieval history, and I went on to study medieval history and medieval archaeology at university, and I was obsessed with armour, and I got replica, when I could afford it, I got replica longsword made and all that kind of stuff. That's all my history now. But it's funny because I started collecting Victorian swords primarily because they were the ones I could most afford. Much like the bayonets, I bought the bayonets because I could afford those, and I was kind of gradually going up the ladder. But 23 years or 24 years later, it transpires that the thing I most love is Victorian swords and Victorian swordsmanship. So it's funny because I grew into it. I grew into my collection, as it were, and I appreciate Victorian period swords far more now than I did then. But anyway, coming back to the original question of do I find it hard to part with them? The simple answer is yes, but less than before. So when I first decided that I needed to sell some swords because I was running out of space and I wanted to buy more expensive swords, so I needed to, you know, if I for example, I looked at my collection, I thought, okay, these 2 or 3 or 4 swords, I'm not so attached to those, I'll sell those, and then when I sell those, I'll have a considerable amount of money that I could spend on one sword I really, really like. And funnily enough, one of the earliest really expensive, for me at the time, really expensive swords I bought is behind me down here, and it's still one of my favourite swords. I've actually done a video about this, this sword previously. When I started selling swords, indeed, I found it exceptionally difficult because I was very emotionally attached to all of my swords. I could remember where I got each and every one, and in my mind, each and every one had a bit of a history to me to it as well, because I remembered where I got it. I usually remembered roughly how much I paid for it. I did the research of that sword. I perhaps restored it a bit, cleaned it up a bit, that kind of stuff. So I was really bonded with each of my swords, and so it was really difficult when I started selling. But inevitably, like many things in life, the more you do of something, the more blasé you get about it, and the less emotive it becomes for you. And so now, because a lot of swords go through my collection, and I have a very large collection, there are a lot of swords that I'm not emotionally attached to. And in fact, there's a number of swords which I have in my collection at the moment, which I purely have because they're of a specific type, or they're rare, and they fit into a type which is going to go into a book that I'm intending to make one day. And once I've made that book, I will sell those swords because I'm not emotionally attached to them, and I'm just keeping them for essentially for cataloguing purposes, for documenting purposes. And in actual fact, what might happen is I might photograph and document those swords well enough for the book, and then once I've done that, sell them. So they might be sold well before I ever put the book together finally, if I ever get time to. So absolutely, I do find it difficult to part with swords sometimes. Some swords I have no problem parting with at all. Some swords I buy specifically to sell. If I see a sword and I think that's a pretty good deal, I know that it's worth more than that, so I buy it and then I sell it for what it's worth. I make a little bit of profit on it, and then reinvest that in my collection. Sometimes I buy a sword like that, and that's actually why I'm holding this sword. I buy a sword like this, I bought this to sell, and when I get it, I get attached to it. And so I'm actually really attached to this small sword now, which is a bizarre thing because a year and a half ago, I didn't own any small swords, and I currently own about 4. I just I never really had an interest in small swords, but then I got a nice one, and that gave me an appetite for more. So that sometimes happens as well, that when you're not particularly, you don't think you're going to be attached to a sword, you become attached to it, and that opens up a whole different window of collecting for you. And that happened for me with cutlasses as well, and I know people on this channel know that I love cutlasses. There's lots of things I love, and one of them is cutlasses, and I bought a cutlass again because I saw one that was going quite cheap, and I thought, well, it was covered in rust, and I thought I can clean that up and then I can sell that and, you know, sell it for a bit more, and then buy something else that I want with it, with that money. And I cleaned it up, and by the time I finished cleaning it up, I'd made it solid. It had a rattly hilt, had a loose hilt. I made the hilt solid by repining it. I cleaned all the rust off, I found out that it had been service sharpened, and in the process of cleaning it I found it was actually really quite sharp and I could cut with it. And if you look at videos where I'm cutting with a cutlass, it's that cutlass, and that opened up the world of cutlasses to me and made me realise I love cutlasses. So there we go. So collecting is a funny thing. If you collect enough, eventually you often end up collecting something very different to what you started off collecting, because experiencing things, and this is true of jobs and it's true of girlfriends and boyfriends and pets and all sorts of things, by experiencing life, it often makes you realise that you like things, doing things or being a certain way that you didn't realise in the first place. So it's really important to open yourself up to new experiences and and see, find yourself essentially. So I think for me that's partly what sword collecting has been about, and of course for me it's inextricably connected to the fact that I love historical fencing and researching fencing and sparring and teaching fencing and everything to do with and I love reading about the history, what these things were used for, and the stories of the people who used these objects. And one final thing I want to say about antique swords is that I have a number of replicas in my collection, as you know from showing. I don't have any behind me at the moment, but as you know, I've got long swords and arming swords and falchions and rapiers and everything else. And I have those primarily because I want that type of sword, I want to learn about that type of sword. But for me personally, a replica sword never, for me, and I know other people are different, for me personally, never has quite the same emotional feeling and connection with a replica sword as an antique sword does. And for me, that's because the replica sword is the real deal. It was made, sorry to be crude and blunt or sharp, but it was made to kill people. It was made to be used as a sword. And modern replica swords, they might be used for fencing, or they might be used for test cutting, but they're not made as instruments of war anymore. And in many cases, antiques are better made than replicas are. In many cases, that's true. I do not know anyone, I've never yet seen anyone making a replica sabre that is as good quality as an original 19th century sabre. I'm sure there are people out there who could do it, but you'd have to pay a lot of money, a lot more than you'd spend on an antique one actually. And if you look at the price of antique swords, and then you look at the price of really top quality replica swords, it makes you realise how cheap the antiques are actually, because the amount of work that goes into making them and expertise and knowledge. But as well as that, the antiques have the history connected to them, and it's like getting information straight from a treatise rather than being taught it second or third or fourth hand. For me, it's when you pick up an antique sword, you're holding the real object. There's no supposition, there's no guesswork of, I wonder how close this is to the real thing. This is the real thing that you're holding in your hands. And I think that's an amazing thing, to be able to hold an object from history that could, if it could tell stories, who knows what it might have seen. And it was there. It was there in those history books we read. These objects were actually there, witnessing it themselves. I've got swords that were in the Indian Mutiny, in the Crimean War, and in the Napoleonic Wars, and it's just incredible that those objects are still there and tangible, and you can hold them and own them for a period of time until you sell them or until you die and someone inherits them. But we're custodians of these things, and so we have to look after them. They are, as Indiana Jones would say, it belongs in a museum. But actually, if we left it only up to museums, most of these would rust away in sheds somewhere. So they don't only belong in museums, they also belong in people's private hands, looking after them, treasuring them, and passing them down the generations. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.